Thank you for the invitation and being courageous enough to give me the floor. Because, like mentioned, my specialty is not in the mobility studies, but I think I have adequate enough experiences as a practitioner, but also as a scientist investigating green transition, how we manage climate change and whatnots, to be able to state that we have had perhaps too little attention on the climate mobilities when it comes to actually somehow tackling the issue, but also having the kind of a political understanding of what to do. And I argue that this attention has been inadequate for multiple reasons, but let me start from the most foundational. Ecologists have for several years made the argument that all Earth ecosystems are changing and their species are moving, becoming mobile due to the planetary warming. So everyone is becoming mobile. And this is the reality, despite the political progress and new commitments on the climate change. This is how it is going. For instance, in the IPCC's last report, out of the 4,000 species analyzed, half was found shifting their habitats to somewhere else, to higher latitudes or towards the north or the south. So, in a way, all are seeking continuation of existing in fastly evolving landscapes, and humans, for certain, are not apart from this planetary change. And this is a quote that follows from Rockström, who is the one who introduced the planetary boundaries, and I find this quote quite useful in this context. So, quote, planetary scale and for environmental forcing by human continues, and individual Earth system components are, to an increasing extent, in disequilibrium in relation to the changing conditions. As a consequence, the post-Holocene Earth is still evolving, and ultimate global environmental conditions remain uncertain. And I think this uncertainty is the point of departure when we are talking about mobilities. In a decade or so, an interesting but also very terrifying threshold was exceeded. The human species entered first time in its evolutionary era into the conditions that have never existed before. There is more greenhouse gas emissions in the sky, greenhouse gases in the sky than there has been ever in the history of our species. So in a way, we are at very new terrains for all of us. And what I argue is that this uncertainty of the spaces unfolding due to the climate change should be part of the new kind of spatial understanding and planning as well. So, for instance, according to the best scientific estimations of the tipping points of the polar glaciers melting, they are somewhere in between 1 and 3 Celsius. So I was kind of shocked to realize this point that, in a way, the tipping point might have been already reached, or it is something that we can still avoid. But this potential rise of tens of meters of sea level is something that we cannot just simply overlook when we are planning for futures, not only in terms of mobility, but how we manage ourselves and ensure the respect for the human rights or sustainable development. And for those knowing me, this doesn't come as a surprise that I draw inspiration from this philosopher Bruno Latour, who gives us this kind of a theoretical understanding of where we might understand these mobilities to come. And he discusses in his 2018 book about returning to Earth in a way that might allow us to make more sense about, but also create political strategies to this necessarily happening change of environment and spaces. And in his well-known critiques of modernity, the core matter is the purification of nature and society into distinctive domains in which the former functions more as a stable reserve for the model societies to reach their visions of development. But that was, and increasingly is, a fantasy where the agency of the other than humans were overlooked. So the kind of irony to modernity, even though it has been accused of being too materialistic, that it wasn't never materialist enough to take the seriousness of the problematic relation that it has with the material cycles and biological processes of the world. So when the direct consequences of planetary warming causes loss of lives, livelihoods, and cultural heritage upheld in our daily practices with the non-human world, it's evident that we have simply run out of space and materials to enact our visions of the modern development. Some places might stay as they are, but many don't. What was considered a stable reserve hits us back with forest fires, droughts, and intolerable heat. The very ground that the societies have built their future visions on have begun to shake. And this is the core to returning to Earth as inhabitants, capable of accepting and acting upon the realities of the fastly changing landscapes and the planetary boundaries. In Latour's terms, space has transformed into restless history to which we participate, among others, unquote. Then I move to the topic of the unequal distribution of the climate mobilities. So, while the strategy of discussing climate change as a global problem that affects us all, no one is safe, and all that, it has had the positive sides as a political strategy and messaging, but I think some of the downsides are becoming evident as well. Namely, it is that for many it still remains challenging to understand that why something that is happening globally, it's actually affecting quite differently different spaces and different peoples in the world. So, in a way, we have to make also sense as a political strategy to understand where the pressure to become mobile is high. And this is a capture from the original UNF on the Convention on the Climate Change from the 92. So it kind of gives the outlook of the specific regions that are considered vulnerable to climate change. And of course, those are related then to the pressures to become mobile as well. And of course, this picture has been sharpened, that what kind of risks climate change poses. But the basic idea of the differentiating exposures to climate change has been there for more than 30 years, written in the climate law. And here I would also pinpoint, I'm sorry, it's too small probably, but it also creates the boundary between the North and South, because it specifically mentions that it is the responsibility of the developed countries to mobilize finances, technological support, and other means of implementation for the developing countries. So this bordering also has existed for a long time. And in line with this bordering, it can be stated that in general the global South has it worse when it comes to the climate change. But that doesn't boil down so much to these kind of natural environmental issues than the questions of poverty and inequality. So the vulnerability is a multifaceted phenomena that cannot be reduced into simple criteria. And it's not like that there are always certain regions or certain countries that would be differentiated, but we also have to bear in mind that it's something that it happens internally, between people, between social groups. And this is typically acknowledged in these legal documents as this kind of a chain of vulnerable populations, persons with disabilities, women, indigenous people, and so forth. So typically, it's not like one reason why people are becoming vulnerable to climate change, but for many reasons. But in order to turn these discussions a little bit more concrete, I will give an example of our working environment in Zimbabwe. And probably you wouldn't guess, but this is the great river Sane, through which the great Zimbabwean empire transported its gold to the harbors of Mozambique. And this is how it has been looking for almost 3 years or so. And you can understand the peril that the local farmers have there. It doesn't look great. Not the actual conditions, because they have been losing not only their crops, but also the potentiality for the future crops. And of course, this has been the El Niño years in the region, which also causes drought, but climate change intensifies those as well. But when it comes to these kind of differentiating exposures, who actually needs to move and where? That becomes a more tricky question. Because in this case of Sane, the heaviest brunt is felt by the small-scale subsistence farmers, because, like I said, that they have lost their livelihoods. And for them, it might be, or they are this kind of on the brink of this, making the decision whether to move or whether to continue in having hope that things would change somehow, somewhere, through some kind of action. But here comes also the tragedy and the kind of economic and social conditions in the limits of adapting, for instance, that commercial industrial agriculture could do there. Because the water is, like my friend who was visiting there, she just said that you just dig a bit and the water is down there. That it's not anywhere, but it's not like a surface water that can be used. And of course, if you have the right technologies, it would become possible to use it for farming. But as it is with the poor populations, they have much lesser capabilities to actually adapt, and thus bigger risks also to become mobile. And this is why I think this is a good example given by my South African colleague, who has mostly been working on the issues of gender-based violence, that she gave a comparison that when it comes to these kind of communities living at the edge of the survival, that becoming mobile, it's a bit like staying in a partnership where there is violence. That mostly for women who live in these kind of situations, going out, moving out from the home of violence, it's never a really good option either if you end up in the streets, because then you don't have any kind of coverage or social support mechanisms or finances or whatnots. And this is the similar situation that we face in several corners of the world, that when there isn't like any clear strategies of when to move, where to kind of relocate your livelihoods and cultures, it's a little bit like going on the streets without having any idea how the things will turn out for you. So I think this issue of mobility, it's conditional. It's not like absolute that climate change determines some certain outcomes. It affects, but we also have the opportunities to do something different. And here comes my second example. This was a field visit in Nepal, where we support the communities of the casteless groups, Dalits. And the situation was kind of bleak for them, for this one particular group, because they had been pushed out of their forest homes. Basically, they were living within this kind of old growth forest, but when it was established as a nature reserve, they were kicked out. And the nearest location they were able to find was this kind of a little bit similar riverbed. But there was a river flowing, and they have established this kind of their livelihoods, agriculture, animal husbandry, even schools and whatnots basically on the riverbed. And what we have been doing is to support also these kind of adaptive capacities of the community, that we try to also create conditions that when the river floods, that the outcomes will not be drastic, that lives are lost. But by the end of the day, we also know that there is a certain cycle of flooding, which will, at some point, most definitely create these kind of floods that will result in loss of livelihoods and probably even lives. And this is the dilemma that we face. Because, of course, for those people, it would become much more kind of less risky for the future to move somewhere where they could practice their culture. But the conditions within that country, it's not good for the landless Dalits, who are the kind of the lowest of the lowest caste. So there isn't anybody who is going to, take them hands and say that, oh, here is plenty of space for you, come here. No. It is like either we do this and try at the same time create these kind of conditions that the human rights would be respected, but at the same time we have to try to create also these kind of conditions how to survive. So this is a kind of illustration about the agency that we can create. This is actually not looking like it was much less infrastructure there, but this is the artist vision of the situation. But this is the kind of a situation where we are. But what would happen if the once in 3 decades or so flooding comes? It would leave complete disruption in the kind of average livelihoods of those people living there, and the dislocation of the populations would also be completely uncontrollable. So what we try to do is that we create, through different kind of early warning systems and disaster risk reduction planning, but also by building these kind of localized capacities to mobilize support when the flooding comes. These kind of conditions that the impacts of the climate event wouldn't be as drastic as they are. And for instance, concerning the vulnerable groups, that there would be specific design, for instance, for the persons with disabilities to actually find shelter and not become these kind of victims to the events. And then, of course, the situation is also that we need to think about the possibilities of returning and recovering from these shocks, because that's a main determinant issue also when it comes to the mobility, that can people return to those spaces that have been affected by the climate change. Then to the next issue, about the knowledge and the political collectives of the displaced. And for quite a while, the environment hasn't been focused on, or the kind of a key focus in migration theories, partly due to this kind of a technological optimism that we can sort out these climate change issues and we can adapt as a society. Partly it's related to this kind of a deterministic connotations, at least from the geography we suffer from that environmental determinism paradigm, where the environmental conditions kind of determine the outcomes of societies, which we know it's not true, and partly due to the kind of economic factors overshadowing the other issues. And of course, this is not just in the migration studies, but this is in environmental studies as well, that we studied long issues like representation and political agency and whatnot, without paying too much attention to the actual material grounds shaping the social outcomes. And what we know is that the climate change, it causes long and short-term mobilities depending on the fast and slow onset events. Mobilities can also be divided between those in close proximities and those of international distances. And just of this kind of a balance, the latter is documented more rarely, where mostly the displaced stay within the kind of near regions where the climate impacts are happening, and where you see this kind of worries or dialogues on this kind of international displacement due to the climate mobility or climate issues. I would sadly say that this political space is dominated by the right-wing populist movements and this fear-mongering about the influx of refugees. And I think this is very much true in the issues of development cooperation and humanitarian issues in general, that the most vocal who are taking the public space are these populists who are using these climate-infused migration issues as a tools to demand higher borders between us and them. So it could be stated, now I'm coming to the political stuff, don't worry. In the global north, the climate mobilities, refugees or migrants, are turned more as a political vehicles, but less effort is put into allowing them to become political subjects. This is my interpretation, and correct me if I'm wrong, or we can discuss it later. But those displaced, I think, are tricky political subjects, because indeed, if we understand politics, or at least I understand that they are always drawing together some kind of a collectives of human and non-human resources for certain kind of ambitions that we seek. And in this process, it is always political as well who shall be invited to be part of these collectives and who are those who are left out. So on this particular issue of deciding upon the issue of climate mobilities, I don't have any clear idea where the boundaries of such collectives might be. But I think one principle laid down into the Convention of the Persons with Disabilities might be useful here. Nothing about us without us. So subsequently, I do not find legitimate to making decisions and policies of those displaced by the climate change or about to be displaced without their voice, their agency. But I think immigrants and refugees in general face this exclusion from decision-making collectives quite harshly, coming always from the displaced margins without political representation of their own. So, a political strategies to allow access, capabilities and representation for those displaced by the climate change would be a paramount of importance. And of course the tricky part is that the root causes of displacements, where they would have their kind of a say on the matter, are typically quite far away then from, since they are displaced. So how we are going to kind of bridge these gaps between the policy making and the root causes, for instance, that necessitates this kind of a cooperation between different localities and even countries. And also what I would argue is kind of a tricky, because when it comes to the environmental law, it stipulates quite clearly that we should abide by the polluter pays principle. But when it comes to these kind of root causes, why people actually have to become mobile, to be displaced by the climate change, having this kind of a connection between the polluters and the actual kind of victims of the polluters, it's really far away. And it's also so that it's not acknowledged in the Paris Agreement, for instance. It actually stipulates quite clearly that, for instance, when it comes to mobilizing support from the north to the south, that it's not based on any liability. Not any liability. So polluter doesn't pay. We just show solidarity or whatnots. But then we will enter to this kind of a concrete negotiation and the political forces actually of not negotiating. And what I see is that the reality is that after the signing of the Paris Agreement, it was kind of sedimented into the political domains that the atmosphere cannot handle the kind of a burden that we have put it. And according to Bruno Latour, at the same time, we have had the influential strategy of actually not giving a damn about the realities of the climate change. Because there has been long-term efforts in spreading disinformation about climate sciences, but also entering these kind of political realities where the climate change doesn't even exist. And of course, this is the kind of a message that the Trumpism, for instance, in the United States exemplifies. And the message is, we take your carbon space, we take the atmosphere and treat your lives, cultures and places insignificant. And for certain, approaching this colonialization of the atmosphere and assuming that there would be this kind of a reciprocality, that we would somehow acknowledge, for instance, our responsibility of the increasing climate mobilities is not there when we approach it from this kind of approach. But this same ethos somehow reflects within the climate negotiation, because the fact is that for a long time, the initiatives crucial to the global south, they haven't not gained such a prominent position as an agenda. And I think this manifests in the question of loss and damage, for instance, that there has been this kind of a history analysis how this topic has been disregarded in the international politics. It has been, coming originally from these issues of it's not even a problem whether it exists. Then we come to the question that, can we ever know really about this topic? We don't have the data for it. It's too difficult to attribute certain events to certain, climate change issues. Then we start blaming that, but it's not conceptually clear what we mean by this. And then finally, this question of liability, that, but it is not our problem, that it's a collective problem. And this is the kind of a reality that has been what the Global South faces in these negotiations. And issue of the mobilities, it is something that it's nowadays entering into this global negotiation, but at the very rudimentary level. That when we look at the last climate negotiation end agreement, the global stocktake, it mentions migrants and refugees, for instance, but it's part of these long chains of vulnerable peoples who to include. But that's it, no more. No specific agendas tackling these issues. And there isn't any kind of a specific agenda that we could trust that, this is where we can actually, follow up the situation. And that is, of course, the challenge that we face. But this is my suggestion, and we can continue this on the workshop, that when it comes to the agendas in the international climate negotiations, also to which Finland could have its position, is that when it comes to adaptation, just transition, loss and damage, and gender action plans, these, according to my kind of a best knowledge of the practical outcomes and where this kind of openings for in more rigorous integration of the refugee or the climate mobility issues in general could take place. And this is where we kind of need to find the cooperation and key messages also how to enter, based on the idea of returning to the earth. So this is the final slide, don't worry. So, of course, it's like when you come from the NGO sector, you always have some kind of agenda. It's never like, I'm just producing knowledge. But I'm also trying to create this kind of a sense of mobility and sense of urgency and sense of willingness to work together. But my argument is that when we enter these arenas, there are no silver bullets, because the kind of the governance of the climate agenda, it's so multifaceted, multi-level. So we need to be strategic. Where are the opportunities to actually engage? We wrote this paper, Avenues for Disability Inclusion, Climate and Biodiversity Action, for the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and it mapped exactly this. What are the key spaces to engage? What are the key kind of a cooperation mechanisms that we can engage? Then in Finland, this political issue of the mobilities, it's part of the new reports by the government, which on the one hand sees that, it's a very tricky problem and we somehow need to work on this. And then the other paper on the development and trade says that, it's not so relevant. We just, have to push towards more commercial relationships and all things will be recovered. So in our political sphere, this might be one of the topics where to engage as well. What I hope for researchers is this kind of a support. Without evidence base, the political claims we make lack gravity. And that also creates this kind of a space of stating these kind of overarching statements that, oh, in the near future, 1 billion people will come to Finland, and this kind of political rhetorics that are not based on any realities. And we need to be able also to kind of challenge them by the scientific knowledge. Then securitization, which we see quite highly on the political agenda nowadays, it might serve as a vehicle to discuss about the climate mobilities, because this is, you understand that within this political landscape, the issues of security and securitization is a key, but of course that holds a substantial risks, that how we respect, for instance, human rights, and this kind of a portrayal of the agency of the displaced as well, even though we are talking about in the context of threats. And as boring it is, and this is always the fact, we need to have coalitions between NGOs, scientists, governmental authorities, because the fact is that among those long chains of actors, for instance, who are at risk of climate change, gender is the only one who has this kind of a very concrete action plan. And that has come there just by out of the cooperation between countries, scientists and NGOs. Thank you.